Before we begin, viewer discretion is advised. This content is meant for entertainment. What happens when one of cinema's most disciplined and intense actor sits across from one of Hollywood's most controversial political figures, and a routine promotional interview turns into one of the most crushing confrontations in daytime television history? What you are about to see is not just a celebrity dispute. This is the moment Tom Cruise systematically unraveled Jane Fonda's carefully built image, exposing years of unresolved hypocrisy in less than 20 minutes of live television. This is the story of how an ordinary publicity appearance became an unforgettable verbal battle. This is the moment that proved some wounds never truly fade and some truths refuse to stay hidden. And this is the confrontation that left one of Hollywood's most outspoken activists completely silent, humiliated before millions as her defenses collapsed like paper in a storm. The morning started like any other at the View Studios in New York City. Production assistants followed their usual routines, adjusting lighting and checking sound levels with practiced precision. Makeup artists applied final touches to the hosts, while stage managers confirmed timing and segment cues. The audience took their seats with the familiar buzz of anticipation, their excitement fueled by the knowledge that Tom Cruise would soon take the stage. His name alone carried weight: decades of box office dominance, breathtaking stunts performed without doubles, and a relentless dedication to his craft that had become legendary in an industry full of pretenders. When his publicist confirmed his appearance to promote his latest action thriller, the producers were thrilled. Ratings gold was guaranteed. What no one could have foreseen was that Jane Fonda was in an especially combative mood that day when Tom made his entrance. The studio erupted in applause. He moved with his trademark energy, that tightly coiled intensity that never seemed to fade with time. His smile was warm and genuine as he waved to the audience, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he looked every bit the movie star, radiating confidence and charisma. Whoopi Goldberg stood to greet him with genuine warmth, shaking his hand and motioning him toward the prepared seat. The other hosts offered welcoming smiles, all except Jane Fonda, who leaned back in her chair with an unreadable expression. Her smile existed, but it carried an edge. Those who knew her well would have recognized that look. It was the face of someone ready for a fight. "Tom Cruise, welcome to The View," Whoopi said with visible excitement. "It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for having me," Tom replied, his signature intensity present even in his greeting. "I'm always happy to be here." This show has incredible energy. Whoopi smoothly guided the interview forward, asking about the new film, the preparation, and the demanding training he underwent. Tom became animated as he spoke about the project, leaning forward with the focused intensity that made him such a powerful presence on and off the screen. "This character represents something real," he said, his eyes lit with passion. "He's someone who refuses to back down from what's right, no matter the personal cost. That absolute commitment to principles is what drew me to the role." The words had barely settled when Jane Fonda made her move. Throughout the opening exchange, she had sat with a faint smirk at the corners of her mouth, clearly waiting for her moment. Now she leaned forward, her voice heavy with unmistakable condescension. "That's interesting, Tom," she cut in, interrupting Whoopi's next question. "Because I have to question someone who speaks so much about doing what's right while being part of an organization with such a questionable history of transparency and honesty." The temperature in the studio dropped instantly. The audience fell silent. The easy warmth from moments earlier vanished like water on hot pavement. Camera operators exchanged quick looks, sensing that something serious was unfolding. Tom's expression shifted. His friendly promotional smile flickered for just a moment, quick, enough that only sharp eyes would catch it before he regained composure. But anyone who truly understood Tom Cruise, anyone familiar with his intensity, recognized that look. Things were about to become very real, very fast. Whoopi quickly tried to redirect, her host instincts kicking in to prevent a full derailment. "Well, let's talk about those incredible action sequences in the film," she said with forced brightness. "I understand you performed all of your own." "No, I think this matters," Jane interrupted, her self-righteous tone growing stronger and more confident. "I think this conversation needs to happen. Here we have someone who plays the all-American hero on screen, but in real life is deeply involved with an organization that former members have described as controlling, manipulative, even dangerous. Don't you think the public deserves honesty about that, Tom? Don't they deserve the truth?" By now, the studio audience was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The other hosts shifted uneasily in their seats, visibly wishing they were anywhere else. Joy Behar looked like she wanted to disappear beneath the table. Even Whoopi, usually unshakable, appeared genuinely worried about where this was heading. But Tom Cruise remained composed. Instead, he did something no one expected, something that would define everything that followed. He began to laugh. Not a nervous laugh or a defensive chuckle meant to dodge the tension. This was real laughter, deep and almost amused, as if Jane had just told him the most ridiculous joke he'd heard in years. The sound echoed through the stiff studio, clashing sharply with the heavy atmosphere. "Jane," he said, slowly shaking his head, a hint of pity in his eyes. "That may be the most hypocritical thing I've heard in a very, very long time." Jane's confident expression wavered. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. She had expected deflection, anger, maybe clumsy excuses. Laughter and accusations of hypocrisy were not part of her plan. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising in pitch, surprise unmistakable. Tom's demeanor shifted. The polished Hollywood charm began to peel away, revealing something harder underneath something more dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but each word carried a sharper edge. "You want to talk about questionable organizations and transparency?" he said, leaning forward slightly. "You want to talk about people who present one image while being something entirely different behind the scenes." He paused, letting the words hang before striking. "Jane, you traveled to North Vietnam during a war where American soldiers were dying. You posed for enemy propaganda. You gave aid and comfort to people holding American prisoners of war." His voice carried genuine disbelief now. "And now you want to sit here and lecture me about patriotism, about honesty, about transparency." The studio filled with uneasy murmurs. Several audience members gasped. Jane's face drained of color, then flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, struggling for words that wouldn't come. "That was a different time," she finally stammered. Her confidence was gone. "That was about trying to stop a senseless war that was killing people." "A different time," Tom repeated slowly, his intensity rising in the way that made his performances so magnetic. "Jane, those weren't just numbers in a newspaper. Those were real people. Real families who lost sons and daughters, brothers and fathers, while you were offering comfort to the people firing at them." He leaned back slightly, never taking his eyes off her. "And you want to question my character?" Joy Behar tried desperately to step in, her voice thin and uncertain. "Maybe we should all just take a step back," she suggested, looking to the other hosts for support. But it was too late. The train had already left the station, gaining speed with every second, and there was no stopping it now. Jane Fonda, clearly cornered, reacted the way cornered people often do. She struck back harder. "At least I had the courage to stand up for what I believed in," she snapped, her voice sharper and more desperate. "At least I wasn't hiding behind some cult-like organization that controls every part of my life and tells me what to think and how to act." That was the moment everything changed. Tom Cruise's entire presence transformed in an instant. The Hollywood charm, the promotional smile, the friendly movie star persona vanished like smoke. What stood in its place was far more intense, far more dangerous. This was no longer the media-trained celebrity. This was someone who had been pushed too far. And everyone in the studio felt it. Cult-like organization, he repeated slowly, his voice dropping nearly to a whisper. Somehow that whisper was more frightening than a shout. The studio leaned in as one, straining to catch every word. Jane, let me tell you something about courage. Real courage. Not Hollywood version, not the publicity stunt version, but real courage. He paused, and the silence became unbearable. Courage isn't flying into enemy territory for a photo opportunity. You know will land you on the front page of every newspaper in the world. Courage isn't performing for the cameras while real heroes are dying in rice paddies. Courage is taking responsibility for your actions and living with the consequence, something you've apparently never learned how to do. The audience was completely frozen. Even the camera operators seemed afraid to move. As if any sudden motion might shatter whatever spell was holding this moment together. What had started as a simple promotional interview had turned into something far more intense, more personal, and more real than anyone had expected. Jane struggled to regain control, to reclaim the moral high ground she believed she held just moments earlier. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who, she began, her voice trembling slightly. But Tom cut her off mid-sentence with surgical precision. No, Jane, you are going to sit there and listen. Because for once in your life, someone is going to tell you the truth without worrying about your feelings, your reputation, or your carefully crafted public image. His voice was rising now. That familiar intensity building like a pressure cooker about to burst. Every eye in the studio was locked on him, captivated by the raw emotion and unfiltered honesty pouring out. You want to talk about organizations? Fine. Let's talk about how you've spent decades lecturing everyone else about morality, ethics, and doing the right thing while conveniently forgetting your own mistakes, while conveniently glossing over the things you did that actually hurt real people. The words struck Jane like physical blows. You could see her shrink back slightly in her chair, her confident facade cracking more with each second, pieces breaking away to reveal something far more fragile underneath. But Tom wasn't finished. He was only getting started. You know what really bothers me about people like you, Jane? He continued, leaning forward with that laser-focused intensity that made him such a powerful presence. You think that because you apologized once, or twice in carefully staged PR interviews, it somehow erases the damage you caused. You think that because you've reinvented yourself as this feminist icon, this progressive activist, everyone should just forget that you gave aid and comfort to people who were literally torturing American prisoners of war. Whoopi Goldberg made one last desperate attempt to redirect the conversation and salvage something from the wreckage. Tom, maybe we could talk about your upcoming projects, she suggested, her voice strained with forced professionalism. I know you have some exciting things coming up. But Tom ignored her completely. His focus stayed locked on Jane Fonda, who now looked genuinely shaken. Her hands trembled as they gripped the arms of her chair. Her face had gone pale again. All the earlier fire and certainty had drained away. And the worst part, Tom continued relentlessly. The absolute worst part of all this is that you've never truly owned what you did. Not really. You've made excuses. You've rationalized it. You've reframed it as youthful idealism or political activism or whatever helps you sleep at night. But you've never simply said, I was wrong. I hurt people. And I am truly, deeply sorry for the pain I caused. Jane's hands were visibly shaking now as she reached for her water glass, her earlier bravado completely gone. I have apologized, she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've said many times that I regret. Tom cut in, his voice slicing through her words. You regret it, like it was some minor social mistake, like you wore the wrong dress to an awards show. He leaned even farther forward, his intensity climbing another level. Do you have any idea, any understanding at all what it was like for the families of those prisoners to see you smiling and laughing with their captors? Do you understand the betrayal those soldiers felt when they saw those photographs? When they realized that someone from their own country, someone famous and influential, was giving propaganda victories to the people who were torturing them. The cameras kept cutting between their faces, capturing every micro-expression, every flash of emotion and tension. Jane looked like she wanted to vanish into her chair, to sink through the floor and escape what was happening. Tom, meanwhile, looked like he was just finding his stride, building towards something even more devastating. But here's what really gets me, he continued, his voice rising again. After everything you did, after all the damage you caused, after all the pain you inflicted on real people and real families, you have the audacity, the sheer breathtaking audacity, to sit here and attack my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You came in here with your talking points all mapped out, ready to make me look bad on national television, ready to score cheap points with your political base. He paused, letting the words sink in and settle over the studio like a heavy weight. You want to talk about organizations that control people? You've been controlled by your own ego and your desperate need to stay relevant for so long that you've completely lost touch with basic human decency. Joy Behar finally found her voice, though it sounded uncertain, almost apologetic. Tom, I think you're being a little harsh, she said, her tone suggesting she wasn't fully convinced of her own defense. Tom turned his intense stare toward her, and Joy instinctively leaned back in her seat. Joy, let me ask you something, he said, his voice deadly serious. If someone in your family had been captured in Vietnam, tortured day after day, and somehow survived and returned home broken and traumatized, how do you think they would feel about Jane's little publicity stunt? Would you tell them they were being too harsh for being angry about it? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown down. Joy opened her mouth to respond, realized she had no good answer, and closed it again. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable before Tom turned back to Jane. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jane? His voice softened slightly, but none of the edge was gone. You could have been a real force for good. You had a platform. You had influence. You had the power to truly change people's lives. He shook his head slowly, something almost sorrowful in the gesture. But instead of using that power responsibly, you chose to become a symbol of everything wrong with celebrity activism. You chose personal publicity over real principle. You chose self-promotion over actual service. Jane found some of her voice again, though it was weaker now, more defensive. That's not fair, she protested, lacking conviction. I've spent my entire life fighting for important causes, women's rights, environmental issues, social justice, fighting for causes. Tom echoed, bitterness and mockery in his voice. Jane, showing up at a few rallies and giving speeches isn't fighting. You want to know what real fighting is? He leaned forward again, his eyes blazing. Fighting is what those men were doing while they were being shot at in the jungle while you were posing for photographs with the people shooting at them. Fighting is what those families were doing when they kept believing, kept hoping their sons and husbands would come home. While you were handing propaganda victories to the enemy, that's fighting. What you do is performance art. The studio audience was completely absorbed now, hanging on every word. This was no longer just a celebrity clash. It had become a true confrontation between two opposing worldviews, two different definitions of courage, principle, and responsibility. Everyone in the room could feel the weight of it. Jane tried another approach, desperate to regain some moral footing. At least I've evolved, she said, her voice gaining a little strength. At least I've grown from my mistakes. Can you say the same? Are you really going to sit there and claim your organization hasn't made mistakes, that no one has? Ever been hurt by it? It was a last-ditch attempt to redirect the attack back onto him. But Tom was ready. In fact, he almost seemed pleased she had brought it up again, as if she had just handed him exactly the opening he wanted. You want to talk about evolution, Jane? Let me tell you what real evolution looks like, real growth. His voice grew stronger and more impassioned with every word. Evolution is taking responsibility for your actions without making excuses. Evolution is admitting when you're wrong without trying to justify why you were wrong in the first place. Evolution is understanding that some things can't be undone, can't be taken back, and the best you can do is try to live better going forward. He didn't slow down. The words kept coming with conviction and force. But what you've done isn't evolution, it's image rehabilitation. You've spent decades trying to rewrite history, trying to make people forget what you really did. Trying to recast yourself as some kind of wise elder figure who simply learned lessons from youthful mistakes. Tom shook his head firmly. Wisdom isn't learning how to spin your failures better, Jane. It's understanding the real cost of those failures. It's recognizing the genuine human damage you caused and carrying that weight with humility. Jane looked genuinely devastated now, all of her defenses stripped away. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice barely audible as tears formed in her eyes. You don't know what it was like back then. The pressure, the confusion. Tom shot back instantly, his voice sharp as steel. Jane, let me clear that up for you. When your country is at war and your countrymen are dying, you don't fly to the enemy's capital and pose for propaganda photographs. That isn't confusing. That isn't complicated. That's basic human decency. That's fundamental loyalty. That's simple common sense. He paused as if collecting himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, yet somehow even more intense. The entire studio leaned in to hear every word. You know what really bothers me about this whole conversation, Jane? It's not just what you did 50 years ago. It's how you've handled it ever since. You've built an entire career around being the victim. Poor Jane, she was young and idealistic. Poor Jane, she was manipulated by the anti-war movement. Poor Jane, everyone was so cruel to her when she was only trying to stop a terrible war. Jane's face turned completely white. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. That's not, she began weakly, but Tom wasn't finished. Here's the truth. You've never been willing to face the truth you've spent decades running from. You weren't the victim in Vietnam, Jane. Those prisoners were the victims. The families waiting at home were the victims. The soldiers who came back and learned that a Hollywood actress had given propaganda. Victories to their captors, they were the victims. He leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. You were just someone who made a choice and refused to live with the consequences. And you've been making excuses for that choice ever since. The silence in the studio was overwhelming. Camera operators stood frozen, as if any movement might break the moment. Sound engineers watched their equipment with intense focus, unwilling to miss a single syllable. Everyone knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would be discussed for years. And now? Tom continued, his voice rising again, gathering force like a wave. You want to sit here and lecture me about questionable choices? You want to challenge my integrity, my judgment, my beliefs? He shook his head slowly, a trace of disbelief on his face at the sheer audacity of it. Jane, you've spent more time trying to rehabilitate your image than you ever spent truly considering the real damage you caused to real people. You've become a professional victim, playing that role so long and so well that you've convinced yourself it's true. And somehow that's supposed to give you the moral authority to judge others. Jane tried once more to defend herself, desperate to salvage anything from the wreckage. "I was trying to end a war that was killing people," she said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to draw attention to something that was fundamentally wrong." "No," Tom said firmly, cutting her off without hesitation. "You were trying to get attention. That's it. If you truly wanted to end the war, there were countless ways to do that without giving aid and comfort to the enemy. You could have protested at home. You could have lobbied Congress. You could have used your fame to raise awareness without traveling to Hanoi and posing for photographs." He leaned forward again, his eyes locked on hers. "But none of that would have put you on the front page of every newspaper in the world, would it? None of that would have made you the center of the story. And that's what you really wanted, to be the star of your own political drama, no matter who got hurt along the way." The accusation struck like a thunderbolt. Jane looked as if she'd been physically hit. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Tears streamed freely down her face now, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run. "You want to know the difference between your choices and mine?" Tom continued relentlessly. "My choices, my beliefs, my commitments are about trying to help people, trying to make things better, trying to contribute something positive to the world. Your choice in Vietnam was about making yourself the center of attention in someone else's tragedy. And that's exactly what you're trying to do here today." Whoopi made one final attempt to regain some control over the show. "Maybe we should all take a breath," she suggested weakly, looking to the other hosts for support. Maybe we need to, but Tom was fully in motion now. There was no stopping him. "You know what I find most revealing about this entire exchange, Jane?" His voice now carried true disappointment alongside the anger. "You began this conversation by attacking my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You came in here with every talking point prepared, ready to make me look bad on national television, ready to score cheap political points." He paused, letting the tension stretch. "But the moment the spotlight turned back on you, the moment someone asked you to account for your own actions and your own decisions, you fell apart. Your whole righteous crusade collapsed like a house of cards." Another pause, longer, heavier, "And that tells me everything I need to know about your character. It's easy to throw stones when you think you're standing on the moral high ground. It's a lot harder when someone reminds you that your own house is made of glass." Jane looked completely devastated. The confidence and self-righteous certainty she'd begun with were gone, replaced by something that looked very much like shame. She seemed to shrink into her chair, unable to meet Tom's gaze, unable to face the cameras, unable even to look at the other hosts. Jane Fonda remained seated for several seconds, still staring at her hands as the tears continued to fall. Finally, she looked up at the camera with an expression of complete and total defeat. The woman who had walked in ready for battle, armed with talking points and righteous certainty, had been utterly dismantled. And everyone watching, in the studio, in the control room, and in millions of homes across America, knew it. The cameras cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. The moment was preserved forever, captured in high definition for anyone who ever wanted to see what happens when someone attacks one of Hollywood's most intense, most prepared performers and realizes too late. They brought a knife to a gunfight. What began as a routine promotional interview had become something else entirely. A masterclass in defending yourself without losing composure. A lesson in turning an attack back on the attacker. And a reminder that some wounds from history never fully heal, no matter how much time passes or how many apologies are given. After the show ended, one question dominated social media and news coverage for days. Did Tom Cruise go too far? Or did he simply say what millions of Americans had been thinking for decades but were too polite to say aloud? Whatever the answer, one thing was absolutely certain.